Hello, I'm Troy Abels from Hanford, California, and you are listening to Gospel Tangents.
It's the best source for Mormon history, science, and theology. I'm Rick Bennett. Mormons are known as being reliably Republican. It wasn't that way in 1844 when Joseph Smith was running for president, however. We'll learn that they were quite the swing voters and could tip an election one way or the other. It's going to be a very fun conversation with Dr. Derek Sainsbury, and he's going to talk more about the Whigs and the Democrats. Republicans didn't exist in 1844, and how Mormons alternated between the two parties. So check out our conversation. Before we get to that, I just wanted to mention one more thing. As you know, Gospel Tangents has teamed up with the Dialogue Podcast Network. We can now be heard on lyceum.fm, that's lyceum.fm, so you can hear all your favorite podcasts, such as the Dialogue Podcast Network, Gospel Tangents, Beyond the Block, and Mormon News Report. So if you want to hear all of us, and we release every few days, so you'll get a lot of updates. So go to lyceum.fm and subscribe there. Now back to our conversation. Now, it's interesting you said Democrat and Whig because there was no Republican Party in 1844.
No.
So Republicans didn't exist. Are Whigs, were they pretty similar with Republicans back in the day?
It's when the Whig Party falls apart, from the ashes of that, you're going to get a couple of different parties that coalesce into the Republican Party in the 1860s.
I mean, because I think this is a good...
So, just for example, Abraham Lincoln, he's a Whig at this time.
Okay, that's
Illinois.
Great. Yeah. So as we look at it, because it's kind of interesting, Democrats and Republicans today are not the same as Democrats and Republicans in 1842 or 1844. I guess it's 1844 was when he declared his candidacy. So as we look at that, Democrats were mostly in the South, and Whigs, I think, were mostly in the North, right?
Yes.
And now it's flipped.
Right. But there was there were also some. I mean, it wasn't quite that sectional yet.
Okay.
But predominantly, yeah, you're correct.
Yeah. So because we've got Republicans kind of dominate the South and the West, except for the coasts.
Right.
And Whigs kind of dominated the North. And so Whigs, because when we think about it, Democrats were kind of pro-slavery back then. Were Whigs? I don't want to make them sound like they're enlightened people,
right?
But they were against slavery.
They were more likely to be. There were Whigs in the South as well, because the difference between Democrats and Whigs was more at this point was more of a difference between Whigs. So the Democrat Party begins with Jackson, right? Andrew Jackson.
Was he really the first Democrat?
He
president?
was in what's called the modern Democratic Party. Yeah,
mm-hmm. Because the Democratic Party goes back even further than that.
Well, it was called different things, right? The Republican Democrats and the Federalists and so forth. But just this idea of a Democratic Party starts with the election of Andrew Jackson, and he is the people's candidate, right? I mean, he's populism. He lets people come in and basically trash the White House, and he's the one that brings the spoil system that if you win, you replace everybody in government with who you want. And he is for individual rights and for Democrats are way strong for state sovereignty.
Individual white rights.
Yes, absolutely.
Because he wasn't for individual black rights at all.
Well, and even individual male landowning rights. But he actually wanted to extend it to those, and they do extend suffrage to those who don't own land. So he's a very populist Democratic, and he seems to be causing. The Whig Party doesn't exist. The Whig Party is in response to what's happening with this new Democratic Party, and they call themselves the Whigs. So they would make fun of Andrew Jackson. They would call him King George, or King Andrew, excuse me, because he was ruling with such a, this whole spoil system, and what I say goes. And there's almost this popularity to him. He'd been a successful general in the War of 1812, right? And there's this huge, almost worshiping of him.
Wasn't he Stonewall Jackson too?
No, that's not him.
That's not him.
That's not him. But anyway, so the Whig Party grows up against that, and Whigs are more, instead of the laborers, the business owners, right? Instead of liking local and state government, wanting federal government and more interaction, more commerce, building roads, that kind of thing. And so the Whigs took on the name Whigs because the Whigs were the political party, opposition party in England against the king, against the Tories. And so that's why they called themselves the Whigs, because they were in opposition to George, or excuse me, King Andrew, right? Andrew Jackson.
But King George was the
original, right?
Yeah.
With the Revolution. And so actually, the Democrats and Whigs are evenly split in Missouri, so much so that this large influx of Latter-day Saints is going to determine politics in Illinois the whole time they're there.
So they were the original swing voters.
Exactly. Well, yeah, in a major sense, and they started to be seen that way by the time of the election in 1844. They started to be seen that way by major newspapers back in the East. That not only could they decide the vote in Illinois, but maybe they could decide the vote in a bigger way. And there was this perception too that we had more people than we actually did have, right? And so there was this perception that something could come out of all of this.
Now, Jackson was president around the time that the church was restored. Is that correct?
That's right. So he is president of the church from
President of the U.S.
Church. President of the United States from 1820, I want to say 28 to 36, right? And then the man behind the curtain, Van Buren, who kind of, the little magician they called him, who kind of put the Democratic Party together, he becomes then the president following him in 36. And, that's when Joseph goes and meets him in 39, so disgusted by him. Most church members had been natural Democrats, Jacksonian Democrats. And Joseph comes home from that visit and says, we're never voting for that man. And so the Saints in mass actually vote for the Whig, William Henry Harrison in 1840, who does win the election. And not because of their vote, but they do vote for Whigs. Mm-hmm. And like I said, they got this awesome charter, this awesome legion, a lieutenant general commission, because both parties are stumbling over themselves to court the Saints. And so
they're not doing that anymore.
They're not doing that anymore. But that afforded Joseph an opportunity to kind of create what he thought would be an atmosphere where he could be protected.
So Governor Boggs was in Missouri. Then they got kicked out. The new governor was Governor Carlin
in Illinois.
Illinois, and then Ford replaced him
in 1842.
So it was Carlin that made Joseph a lieutenant governor, and Carlin was a lieutenant general. Yeah. Carlin was was he a Whig or a Democrat?
He was a Democrat.
He was a Democrat.
And so now they're going to, in the 1842 election, gubernatorial election, the Saints, actually, they're the ones supporting Ford. They actually support Ford, who wins pretty handsomely.
Because of the block voting for the Saints? Or?
Yeah, well, not just because. I mean, he wins Hancock County because of that, but the Saints' vote difference wouldn't have made a difference. He would have won anyway. He would have won anyway. But in all local elections, that was for sure a thing. And coming up in 1844, the Saints were only growing and growing and growing and growing. And Illinois law allowed someone who moved into Illinois to vote 6 months later, even if they were foreign. And so you have all these English converts that are also showing up, right? And they're allowed to vote within 6 months' time. And so the block of people that are Latter-day Saints in Western Illinois is just growing and growing and growing. And so when he kicks this campaign off, like I said, he sends this political pamphlet out that's his platform. And it's actually a very forward-looking platform for the day. He calls for fewer congressmen with lower pay. He calls for prison reform. There's still a time of debtor's prison, and he's experienced a lot of prison himself and corrupt justice system. He calls for expansion to take to bring into the Union Texas, which was an independent republic at the time, to bring into the Union Oregon. And so he's for expansion, what's called Manifest Destiny later.
Jackson was a Manifest Destiny guy, wasn't he?
That term really didn't exist, but yeah, I mean, Democrats wanted to push west, wanted to continent to continent, right?
Coast to coast.
Coast to coast, sorry, yeah, the whole continent, coast to coast. And so he also advocated for a national bank with branches in every state. The biggest two things that he advocated was, the one is that he advocated the sale of federal land, which there was still a ton of federal land in the territories west of the Mississippi, to purchase the freedom of the slaves. And so he wasn't like a radical abolitionist, but he believed that in that political pamphlet, he says that we should sell that land and purchase the freedom of the slaves and allow them to labor and work for money just like anyone else. And so that's a way forward-looking thing, right? That even some politicians later will say, boy, someone had put up an idea that might have avoided this civil war when they look back. And then finally, the biggest thing that he advocates is more power for the president to be able to interfere in the states if something's going wrong, as it happened in Missouri and was now starting to happen in Illinois. The Bill of Rights could not be enforced by the federal government in states. It was a federal thing. And it's not until the 14th Amendment, which is passed after the Civil War, that all the liberties of the Constitution, of the U.S. Constitution, can also be enforced inside of states. And so this platform goes out, and it gets commented on by newspapers all over the country. Some make fun of it. Some say, oh, this is a good idea, but this is a bad idea, so forth and so on.
I hope you enjoyed our conversation with Dr. Derek Sainsbury. In our next conversation, we're going to talk about electioneer missionaries. It turns out that Joseph Smith called more missionaries than ever to help campaign for his presidency. I asked Dr. Sainsbury how it compares to today's numbers.
Jeez. Can I use my calculator? You're looking at in the hundreds of thousands of missionaries.
Hundreds of thousands. And I know we've got the coronavirus, but we were having 60,000.
Yeah, you're looking at a lot more than that. You're looking at hundreds of thousands.
So 2 to 3 times more of that?
Easily.
If you'd like to hear the entire interview uncut, please subscribe to patreon.com/gospeltangents. And for just $5 a month, you can hear the entire interview without any interruption. If you'd like a paperback version of our transcripts, go to amazon.com and do a search for Gospel Tangents interview. Also, if you'd like to give the money to me and not Amazon, please subscribe on my website, and I'll be able to send you a transcript as soon as they are completed, and click the subscribe button. You can also find our latest information on facebook.com/gospeltangents, as well as we're on Twitter @gospeltangents. And don't forget to subscribe on Apple Podcasts. The link is at tinyurl.com/gospeltangents, and you can subscribe there. Also, please give us a 5-star review. If you want to support all of the podcasts as part of the Dialogue Podcast Network, go to lyceum.fm, that's lyceum.fm, and do a search for Dialogue Podcast Network or Gospel Tangents, because, that's a pretty cool one too. Thanks again for listening. Click here to subscribe, here for a transcript, and over here we've got some of our great videos. Thanks again.